All right, welcome back, folks. During the break, a couple of possible additions to the agenda came across my desk here. One was a request that we spend a little bit of time reflecting on the previous meeting, so that we can talk a little bit about the takeaways that we all gleaned from the NASRA presentation, which right now feels like it was a month ago, but really was not that long ago. So I think we should probably try to fit that in right before we do agenda planning at the end of the day, depending on how our afternoon schedule plays out. And then the other request, or the other possibility for addition to the agenda, is that we have the report back from the actuary on the impact of revenue on the different systems. And so I'm wondering if we might be able to sneak that in maybe right after Paul Silo talks to us this afternoon. Chris Roop has some slides on that, and he said it won't take us long to go through that. And I feel like we should probably jump on that, since we know our job here is to tee up the next set of questions that we have for the actuaries. So Annette, I'm going to let you go ahead and get us started on brainstorming questions we might ask of the actuary. And I want to say a big thank you to the teachers and state employees and Troopers Association for responding to Jeanette's call for for some ideas or levels of support of the various ideas. And I think what we should do right now is try to go through and have a discussion about the feedback that you've all sent to Jeanette.
So this, I think everybody has a copy of this. Gail handed it out. It looks like this. It's a list of, Eric?
Yeah, can I just maybe a procedural question on this feedback before we get started? I was kind of, I guess I was under the impression that it wouldn't just be teachers, state employees, and troopers, that all the members of the task force would be contributing ideas. Did that happen?
I have mine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you request it of everyone?
I sent it to everyone. But I did, and I thank people for their responses. And what I got was a combined response that the NEA people did kind of together, and a response from Eric and Fiona and Dan.
It'd be good to bring everyone's perspectives into the conversation, I think.
So maybe what we should do right now is take the time to go actually more systematically around the table.
Yeah.
As we're talking about each of these, as opposed to just calling on the folks who already submitted.
Yeah,
feedback.
and so what this is the list as I interpreted it from our previous meetings of possible options that had come up. I then sent it to Chris, who had a couple other notes that he had made of options that came up from people, and then also asked him to make a note on here. There had already been actuarial work done on those issues, so that we wouldn't have to repeat it. If it was really old, then we might have to, but if it's already been done, then so the red on here is our Chris's responses that work has been done on it or has not. So do we want to start with the general? Should we just start and go through it? Is that what everybody thinks is a good way to do it? All right, so let's start with the general, which is the amortization. And there are two suggestions there. One of them is the layered amortization for future unfunded liability, and I believe that kind of came from NASRA, that they had that on their list. And the other is, well, you can read it. I'm not going to. And just for your information, I had an eye exam yesterday, and they dilated my eyes, and they're still a little blurry. So if I am not reading it right, just let me know. So do we want to start and look at that as and the way people responded here was, most likely to support, least likely to support, or so-so. So we want to start, Peter, do you want?
Certainly.
Oh,
Microphone in front of me, please. Thank you. So Peter Fagan, been away for a week at a family wedding, and I don't bring email with me.
good work.
Such restraint.
600 emails I had when I got home. What you pay for visiting family, which I will happily pay each and every time I do it. So going through this document last night, I really only had just so that you know, I had one aspect of I don't think we should do this, which is status quo. Everything else I felt was on the table. As far as the amortization piece, Steve Klein also had recommended the layered approach, and I had talked to him earlier about a layered approach. Some months ago, I was looking at it. So the layered approach for future not losses, but not meeting the 7% goal of the investment returns is something that I would personally support. And then cap the in FY28, starting in 28, cap the ADEC growth to a percentage. I agree with that because we've all seen the future probability of what the general fund growth could be, might be, and making sure that the ADEC growth fits into the growth of the general fund is really important. So I would concur with that as well.
Thank you.
Corey Parent, the ones, I support, similar to Peter, I don't think we can say nothing, but, there's varying levels of support for me. I'm a big fan of looking at the employee contribution, getting that over time. But at the same note, I'm not supportive of removing all automatic COLAs. I think a COLA is needed in some capacity at some level. And then I think it's, from there, I like a lot of the kind of the risk sharing ideas, the opportunities, especially within the school districts, when they have surplus funds, is there an opportunity to take some of those and invest them into their teachers and their staff's retirement. So I think those were, I kind of play with, I think, focusing on where we can try to find the increased asset and then talk about, what we may have to change for benefit. But I'm not supportive of raising taxes either. So that's part of the increased asset conversation.
So before we go to Michael, if there are categories here or things that kind of everybody either agrees we're likely to support or agrees that we don't want to go there at all. If that happens if there happen to be any on here where we can come to consensus about them right now, let's do that so that we can just make sure that those are on the table, but we don't have to talk about them again until we get to actually figuring out how we approach them. Does that make sense? Okay.
We did agree to remove vesting last time, so we did
Yes, we
accomplish
did.
one.
We're down one and we added about 20 more, so.
Corey, can you just repeat the last thing you said? I missed.
I'm not, I would be supportive of raising taxes.
Would not, okay.
That's my whole legislative career. I've only done it once for water quality and not to vote for those things. So
Okay, thanks.
Michael Clausen, as the non-voting member of this committee, I'm not going to take a position on any of the specifics other than to say that the Treasurer's Office supports this committee coming up with recommendations and hopefully being passed by the legislature and signed by the governor next legislative session that would have a significant impact on reducing the liabilities associated with both the VESTers and VESTers pension funds.
Andrew Emmerich, just first off, I feel very strongly with this issue that as we go through things, top priority that I have really is that significant use of one-time funds and new revenue. And when we can have agreed consensus there, talking about some of the other aspects, just thinking about the amortization, like Peter was referencing, I'm also really curious about the layered amortization. I think that's a really interesting idea, and would love some of these items that we've heard about as we find maybe some common connections, maybe going back to look at those topics more specifically to kind of get our mindsets on those would be great.
Molly Stoner, as you said, our union work collectively, so just tagging on a little bit to what Andrew said, I also really support the use of one-time funds and looking for new revenue as our first avenue. And if we need to, after we do that, then looking at possibilities beyond that. I agree with Corey that looking at the idea of no COLA feels off the table for me, if we're allowed to say that. That's a big red for me, the COLA piece. I know Corey spoke about some. I kind of feel like a lot of the COLA things in here in our list rub me wrong. Yeah.
I guess it's me.
It sure is.
So I went through and I put ones beside a lot of them because along with Peter, I think that most of this should be on the table. There were some things that I had least likely to support, and one of them was the new revenue. And I didn't have a least likely beside ongoing infusion of funds above ADAC. I didn't have least likely there, but I did have a least likely around new revenues. So in my mind, there's a difference there between revenues going into the fund and generating new revenues. I also, looking at it, I don't have mine here. I did agree with the education fund absorbing most of the costs for the OPEB costs and for ongoing, and that goes along with, on the very bottom, there was one that said something about penalty for paying a penalty for early retirement. And I think that if people retire before they're eligible for Medicare, that the education fund has to absorb that cost. It shouldn't be a general fund cost. And that there might be some, I don't know how that would work, and I don't know how you would do it for state employees who retire before, if there's if they have to continue paying for their health care until they are Medicare eligible. I mean, that's a possibility, but I think that
Do we have a line item on here that specifies OPEB before Medicare eligibility? Because that seems to be what you're saying right now, and that
I'm
we
trying
want
to find
to
it here.
do some exploration of that.
We've definitely talked about it.
Okay, yep, impose financial penalty for offering retirement before member is Medicare eligible.
Yeah, and what that would be is either the member paying for their healthcare costs, or the school district paying, or it could be,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's flag that as something we should think about.
And then most of the COLA things, I actually, I'm not a retiree, so it doesn't really impact me personally and financially, but I do think that particularly the limiting the COLA to a certain level of the retirement benefit, whether that's 25,000 or whatever, and applying the COLA to the lower amount, so that people who who are retiring at the lowest income levels. And we have a lot of people who are not getting big chunks of money in their retirement. That they wouldn't be penalized, but people who are having large retirement amounts would not have a COLA on the top tier. That was, I think that was important.
Could I just ask you a question? Jeanette?
Sure.
Because I might have read that differently, so I just want to make one. I'm just making sure I understand. So when it says restrict early retirement incentives,
Mhm.
I was looking at that as that's something that that's a state policy, right? We're going to offer some incentive to have people retire earlier, like they did a few years ago. Is that accurate?
It could be, or it could be, I was thinking here about
Yep.
particularly teachers, that a district might decide to
Sure.
give an early retirement incentive, and they aren't yet eligible for Medicare. So the district doesn't see any penalty for that, or any cost
Okay.
to that, but the state does. So I'm thinking that there needs to be some restriction on that.
Okay, I just didn't, when it says
Yeah.
impose financial penalty, I was just trying to understand where you were coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you. Thank you.
Okay,
So just for
I don't know how
clarity, when we started around the table, were you all responding to this entire document? I had kind of thought that we were responding to the
The
first section or the
one,
first
yeah.
page.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
We got some responses.
And then-
yeah.
I think Peter
I
responded
was
to
in
the first.
general, the entire document, but specifically the first.
Yeah, so I wanted to actually see if the first one is amenable to people.
The first what?
The
Amortizing?
first under amortization, either a layered schedule or the any losses after that period are in a separate amortization schedule.
Can I offer fourth grade classroom strategy? Yeah, well, maybe. Yes, yeah.
Let the record show everyone who's answering
Yeah,
has a
so-
thumbs up.
so-
Thumbs up, yeah.
Okay, oh, I put a star beside it. Okay,
Yes, but
good.
also.
All right,
Eric has a
yes.
question, statement.
So on that amortization piece, something we're I feel like we're just kind of delving into, and maybe I'm going into too much detail for our discussion here, but I had another suggestion we might want to look at. And I could take that here, or we could take it at another, when we're actually discussing to go to the actuary.
Throw it
In
out.
general, I'm supportive of it, because I think the volatility as we get to the end of the amortization schedules is something we should definitely deal with. And it seems like tiered amortization is a recommended actuarial practice, so we should probably adhering to that. But there's, we could talk about different ways to implement the schedule.
But in general, we're agreed that this is an area where we should continue to pursue.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right. How about risk sharing? Oh, John,
I would just like to support what Eric said on that. I think volatility is the issue with respect to amortization, so we should look at all ways to reduce volatility with respect to amortization going forward, including the layered approach, and just see if there are things there. And I also note is just because amortization is also need of OPEB funding, is that we don't really have a separate area on this document with respect to OPEB. And I also think with respect to amortization, we have to be careful not to repeat what I would consider a mistake with respect to our current amortization schedules for pensions with OPEB. We should look at a different method than I believe the treasurer has proposed in the documents that she has provided us.
Add one more thing to that, John. The volatility being a concern, obviously I agree with. There's one other element of the amortization I think we should be mindful of, and that's our current schedule forecast increases of 3% a year. We know that's over the long-term growth rate. So that kind of sets up a bit of a conflict down the road. And we should, that's something I'd like to think through when we discuss more.
No, again, I totally agree that that is a problem that we need to figure out how to solve.
May I just ask clarifying? I just want to see if I'm understanding. So your concern about it is that the final year, because that 3% is off, that final year or several years would just be huge payment. Is that correct?
It's gonna be growing as a share
Yeah.
of the general fund ever larger.
Okay,
It's set to increase at a level higher than we forecast.
that's what I thought. That's what I thought.
Essentially baking in unsustainability
Right.
because the rate of growth
It's
of
not.
the payment is going to exceed the rate of growth of revenues.
That's what I thought.
The trade-off to that is if you lower the rate of growth in your payments, your initial payments in the early years will be higher. So
Yes.
That's the trade-off.
Unless you were to change the amount of use.
Years.
Yeah, in setting, extending the schedule maybe to accommodate a 2% growth rate.
Or layering, right? Finding a layered approach.
And one thing I just want to throw out there is, the amortization stuff is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for us to model actuarially, just because we don't know what's going to happen to the balance of the unfunded liability in the future. But this strategy will not reduce the liabilities. What this is a financial risk mitigation strategy.
Okay, so how about this sharing?
Is that just in general risk sharing? or
Well, it's,
Because we go into more risk sharing specific stuff.
Well, there's a lot more
There, I
specifics.
think, is the tied to COLA, is tied to employee contribution. I think we're just going like one thing at a time, right? Right?
I did have a comment when I was filling it out, though, that it seemed like risk sharing was also dealt with under the COLA
It
and
is.
contribution rate
Yeah.
section.
Yes.
So I put a note in there.
Okay.
Yeah, I answered this, below.
Okay, so let's just put that off for the COLA part. Put in. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, new plans for new hires?
I said, on the middle one. I said no for the, I'm sorry, I was the one who said no support. You were like least likely. I'm like, no, I don't want it. But I said to offer hybrid DVDC. I was no on that, but the rest I was. Okay, most likely.
Can I just ask procedurally, with the masks, it's hard to understand each other. If people could project a little more, that'd be great. At least my old lady ears are struggling.
You want me to put on my acting voice? Because I can project.
You put on
Speak
your
to the
acting voice or your teaching voice, Liana.
Or we did have a suggestion from the Joint Rules Committee yesterday when they met, that when you speak, you can lower your mask, just as you do when you eat.
Except that when we speak is when our droplets are most projectile.
Well, I won't look at you. You can project them out there. Okay, so, but I saw a bunch of thumbs down on these plans for new hires. That we do not have to agree on. Eric?
I was in the middle on that. I'm open to it, but we also have to think through what's adequate for recruitment. So it's open, but it's a tough question. Sorry, I did not adhere to the mask or the vocal thing, so we'll try to do that a little bit.
He's open, but has some questions.
The Eric interpreter. Andrew?
And just procedurally, I'm assuming, and I think we've agreed on this, I just want to make sure that what we're really trying to search for right now is where there's a consensus, just so that way we know. But if there's, like this one, it seems like maybe there's not consensus. Doesn't mean that we're done with conversation on it, but just trying to find that level ground.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the way I see this.
Yeah.
If there's consensus, yes.
Yeah.
Then we will continue the conversation
Right.
at some point in more detail. If
Perfect.
there's consensus, no, then we'll just cross it off.
Yep, great,
And if there isn't consensus, then we'll continue the conversation.
great. Just wanted to make sure I understood correctly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what I thought. Great minds, enough. Okay, education fund comments? Oh,
What?
Some
Sustained
thumbs
fund?
ups, but
to what do you mean, to what? Oh, for the whole thing, or do you want to go the
There's 3 questions.
3 questions, okay?
Molly has her hand up.
I had a question about, I didn't feel like I could judge on this one, and the note that the three of us, as we were talking about, it, the note that we had is that we weren't ranking it as red, yellow, or green because we didn't feel like we'd had enough conversations to make a judgment about it, and also we knew that even within our state legislature, the House and the Senate have some different opinions, so we thought it was maybe beyond our scope at this point. So I don't really know what to do with that one. I can't give it a thumb.
I'll tell you what, my bottom line on this is that the education fund should reflect all costs of education, whether it's pension, OPEB, whatever. It should be reflected in the education fund. That's so my answer to all of these is, yes, it should come out of the education fund. That's,
And I guess my concern about that, if I'm understanding, and again, I don't have a lot of information, so this is potentially my ignorance speaking, but my concern about it is that I think of the education fund as slightly more progressive, less progressive than an income tax. And I have a philosophical concern about that. So if we're putting large unfunded liabilities into a place where it'll get funded through property taxes as opposed to through income tax, then I would give it, I'm more inclined to put my thumb down.
oh, I see what you're saying. But if we really look at the property tax, that is pretty progressive
Because
we do the whole rebate system. So it really, your property tax is based on your income.
And that's what I don't know enough, you know, I'd have to look at how those
Yeah.
balance out, I don't know enough.
I
about
think
it.
about 70% of Vermont get a rebate.
So I had a similar note to Molly's that the latter 2 options, I think there might be merit to, but I think we'd probably need some more testimony. I felt like I didn't have enough information to weigh in, but I could consider them. The first one, should the education fund pay for OPEB costs? That one I felt like that should happen. And Peter, did you say that happened last year? I thought I recalled a conversation from a prior meeting where there was a comment to that effect, but I didn't, when I was reflecting on this question, I wasn't sure if that was accurate.
I don't remember. I have to look it up to be sure.
I think that you
We
put
did-
some things into the education fund, but didn't put all and didn't put any future unfunded liabilities or anything in.
No future unfunded liabilities went in. There was a bonded payment of somewhere in the 30s millions of dollars from the prior year. It sounds like it was current year OPEB cost, but I don't, without going back.
Chris,
I can't say yes or no.
In that
Come up
big
here, I
bind that we have.
I can answer that. So Representative Figgins, exactly right. Last year during the budget process, there was differences of opinion on this issue, and where they ended up landing was they reserved $14 million in the ed fund out of the ed fund surplus last year to hold in reserve pending conversation and recommendations from this group. But the reason why $14 million was pointed out was that is roughly equivalent to the OPEB normal cost based on the latest GASB report that was done on the teacher OPEB cost. So that it was like 13.8 change, but they rounded up to 14 million, and that's held in reserve. And that's just the normal cost if we were to be funding it, the benefit on an APEC basis, the way we are with the pensions. The other thing Representative Fagan noted was the normal cost on the pension side is currently charged to the ed fund. The unfunded liability is funded by the general fund. The normal cost was roughly $7 million in FY21.
but because of all the assumption changes that happened in FY '22, that cost went up by about $30 million. So now it's roughly $37 million is coming out of the top of the ed fund to fully fund the normal cost for the teacher pension. So the outstanding question was, how do we fund the OPEB costs? And does it make sense to put some or all of those costs in the ed fund?
So Chris, the pay-go amount for OPEB, that comes out of the general.
Correct. There is also a small portion of it is paid by the local education agencies on teachers hired more recently. It's an flat annual contribution that goes up, I think, with the CPI every year, brings around $4 million in. And there's other factors that go into it, like the EGWIP reimbursements we get from the federal government.
Is that flat fund, that was like a $1,500 per new hire, is that?
It's somewhere in that range, yeah. That will raise more money over time through attrition, obviously, but right now it doesn't fund a particularly large percentage of the total cost.
All right, so we're gonna continue the conversation on that, get some more information. How about no change to current retirees?
We have
All
consensus.
All right, to cross that one off, we don't even need more conversation on it like we do on the first one. And then minimal changes to current employees within a certain number of years of retirement eligibility. And I know that there have been numbers floated like 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 1 year, whatever. So I just put a certain number. It's just a concept.
As a concept, I support that completely, and I think we should have that in the back of our minds, think about what minimal means and what the right time frame means.
And also, I think what components we might be able to consider for close to retire, current employees within a certain number of years, and what things are like no-goes.
Right.
Because you can break that into a lot of different components.
Okay, so we have.
This is Michael. I just want to add one comment to that. Just to be aware, a reminder that there are currently a number of teachers and state employees who are eligible to retire because they've reached their full retirement age for benefit, but they're continuing to work. Just a distinction between when you're talking about, those folks who are not yet retired but close to retirement. We have people who are actually could retire tomorrow or today, just as a point of reference.
Yeah, so we're really.
And that makes me think that we don't want to penalize people who are doing what we want them to do, which is continue to work until you're at Medicare age. So that's the point of what you're saying, it sounds like.
Just to make the distinction that it's not just people who are close to retirement, people who can retire today.
All right, so conceptually, we agree with that, but we need to look at what minimum means, what changes we're talking about, that what the certain number of years is, and removing those people who are eligible for retirement but continue to work from that group. All right, so increase assets, one-time infusion.
Hand up or thumb up?
Hand up.
Hand up.
I agree. It's just, I went back to look at the. Michael here toward me. I went back to look at the funding history for the teachers, which I have readily available to me right here. And from 2007 to current time, we have overfunded the ADEC every single year. So we're doing this now. If we have additional funds, it is a place we have always looked to put additional money. So this is just basically stating our current practice. I agree with it, but just to let you know. And I think that we've probably done the same thing. There might be on the state employees, there might have been 1 year to my knowledge where we actually just funded 100%. But otherwise, we have always overfunded the ADEC, excuse me, whenever we can. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
So just following up on Peter's point, I mean, it's not really caught here in increased assets, but I mean, we could have a recommendation that we should continue our practice the funding above the ADAC.
And I think that the one question that would be pertinent here would be, should we change what we have in statute for our end of year construct, which right now is any unallocated funds that are at the bottom line at the end of the year, 50% going to a spendable rainy day savings account. The other 50% go to OPEB for state employees. Should we change the OPEB part for state employees over to the pension? That's the question. And I would love to hear actually what the treasurer thinks about that. Because she certainly had a hand when we decided upstairs in appropriations to do that end of year construct. It's been changed a few times over the years that I've been up there to put it into the state employees of that. So I'd be interested to hear her thoughts about that.
Comments or on that? I think that there's general agreement that we should continue the practice of doing that whenever possible. Yeah.
One comment on continuing the practice, and I completely, the legislature really deserves a lot of credit for their recent funding efforts. But to say continue the practice versus committing a specific amount, that makes a difference in what the what the assets look like over time for the actual, as we saw in some of the modeling. So the commitment is definitely there, but if it was a specific amount, I think that would help for future funding purposes.
So I might be wrong here, but, and I do agree with you that it would be nice to say a future amount, but I don't know if we can bind the future legislatures. We could say that every year there should be an additional 50 million or 100 million over the ADAC. But next year in 2022, 2023, there's going to be a whole new legislature with whole new appropriations committees, and they don't have to do anything that they don't want to. I think that's true.
Or another way to say it is they wouldn't be obligated to
Right.
spend that money if there wasn't money available, that
Well,
we can't bind future legislatures. to-
even if the money was available, would they be?
No.
Bound
You
to
are
spend
correct.
it? Yeah, we can't commit them. But it is, we could say it.
I don't know if I interpreted this differently, but I was looking at this piece. I totally appreciate where you're coming from, Peter. I really appreciate the financial responsibility since 2007. Thank you for that. And I guess I also was thinking of the one-time infusion referring to the current year we find ourselves in, where there's tremendous money that was unexpected in our economic system because of this pandemic. And so maybe this one, like the one that we wanted to divide into two about there being two groups with the current employees, maybe they're two different components of this one. One being current pandemic related surpluses and the other being ongoing, above the ADEC kinds of expenditures.
Well, I think there are two questions there. One says one-time infusion, and I think that refers to right now.
That's what I thought, but
And
then we
then,
were talking.
and then
about-
ongoing recurring infusion.
Oh, so Peter, was your response to the second bullet?
It was really both, because
Okay.
one of the things that we did is we put $150 million, that hadn't been mentioned in a little while, $150 million aside specifically for any one of the four aspects of the pension to be determined, to the recommendation coming from this group, to determine what we actually apportion where, when we get back in session.
And then we have the actuaries looking at other numbers as per Andrew's requests, additional monies. And so I was thinking of that as
You're right.
well. So I just wanted to make sure that's part of the conversation.
Yeah, see, you're right. So the ongoing the ongoing infusion is what you were talking about.
Correct.
And the
Correct.
one time is that $150 million and maybe additional.
And a question, Jeanette, on your comment. I completely agree that this body can't bind the legislature. I think we can make recommendations. But some of these solutions will probably require statutory changes, and the legislature could bind itself via statute, no?
I don't think we can bind a future legislature.
Okay.
We can make a statutory change, but then the next people come in and they can change that statutory change. And in terms of budgeting, we can't bind anything. We can make not we as a group here, but we, the legislature, can make recommendations for how it should be spent or be allocated, but they make a decision year to year. Isn't that right?
Correct. The only way, just to use some real example,
Microphone.
$150 million.
Microphone.
Actually, on 100, a real example, $150 million was unallocated at the end of the year. So we notwithstood statute to put that into a temporary reserve so that we could then figure out how best to allocate those funds. If we hadn't, then $75 million would have gone into employee OPEB, gone, unretrievable. The other 75 million would actually be sitting on the bottom line because we've actually filled our rainy day reserve, something that I will advocate that we actually expand the size of in the future. So we notwithstand current law all the time, especially when it makes sense to do so, which it always makes sense when we do it.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that. I guess all I'm trying to think through in my head is how, if we were to make a commitment, how we could capture that, maybe it's through the funding policy, so that the actuary can take it into account. That's all I'm trying to think through.
Well, maybe what we should do is flag this as something that we want to come back to, because I think the insertion of the presentation that Chris Roop is going to do this afternoon on the actuary's analysis of the impact of one-time funding might illuminate this conversation. So how about we flag this for now?
Yeah, can I make a suggestion maybe that, that there's two sections here, and the one-time fusion is the 150, which we need to make a recommendation for how that 150 should be split. So that's one thing. And then the other question around the one-time is what Andrew asked the actuaries to do around additional one-time right now. So that one, I think that we're kind of in agreement on I mean, we need to figure out the 150, that's there, and we need to come up with a suggestion. So if we don't, and if we don't make those suggestions, and we don't come up with some agreement here, I think that 150 is likely to go somewhere else.
I'm sure we can find an agreement.
With the money that's already
But,
there.
but I don't mean just around 150. I mean, I think that in the statute, it says that it will be available if there are real efforts to make the fund solvent.
Sustainable.
Yeah. So if we can't come to any agreement on the fund itself, then that 150 is likely to go away. I mean, it may not, the appropriations committees might do it anyway, but they don't, they put that caveat on there. Was that right? We did that? Yeah. Okay, all right. So do we want to talk about ongoing, or do we want to kind of lump that together?
I think we should save all of this for
Okay.
a flag to talk about after we
Got it.
understand the input.
Yep.
From what impact that input of new money would have on the system.
Got it. All right, so we move to employee contributions, which is one way of increasing the assets. So right now, I believe that we have the first. right? It's a fixed amount regardless of the health of the fund. So that's one. And then there was a suggestion of tiered contributions based on income. Yeah,
I
John?
really support your contributions based on income. I mean, Eric and I were talking about Group D, which is the judges. I mean, they are very highly compensated individuals. They get the best benefits of all groups with respect to the state employees pension. I think that's something that we need to seriously consider.
I agree, and I think that while they pay the same percentage of their income is really much higher, so they're paying the same percent that somebody who's making $20,000 a year is, but we have a graduated income tax. We have a very progressive income tax system. And that would be that's the same philosophy here. If you had a tiered, that it's graduated and more progressive, so that people who have more have the ability to pay more. Yeah. Okay. Dan, you had your hand up. I'm
Yeah, I
sorry.
was just, in my mind, I was just trying to understand what that would look like. I guess for me, it's right, isn't that the contribution rate as my pay increases, if I'm contributing 10%, as my pay increases, 10% gets bigger. And so someone who's making less, that 10% is a smaller number, but so I'm just trying to figure out how that tiered thing would look like. Because to me, the contribution rate kind of takes care of that, but maybe I'm reading into it
I
wrong.
think that it would, and you get your raise next week, and it's going to put you in a different income tax bracket.
Mhm.
I think in my mind, it's kind of the same. It puts you into a different bracket for your contribution level.
Okay.
I think Chris
Chris-
might be
oh,
able
Chris,
to.
Yeah, the treasurer's office actually did some analysis on this in the January 15th report, and I'm sure you don't have it all in front of you. I know Gail's got it on the website, but just as an example, the scenarios they modeled were, so instead of everybody paying a flat 6.65, in Group D, regardless of what your income is, what would it look like if 7.4% was the rate on salary up to $54,000? And then 8% on the dollars you earn between 54,000 and 65,800. Then 9% on the dollars you earn between 65,800 and 81, and then 10% on the dollars earned above 81. So it would work, just like Senator White said, similar to a income tax where, if I'm making $81,000, I'm not going to pay 10% on all $81,000. I'm only going to pay that higher rate on the dollars I earned within that bracket. So that example I just said, that was studied, if you are a member with a $60,000 salary, which is pretty close to the median among VSERS employees, that translates to an effective contribution rate of about 7.46% of your salary. So that's a little bit higher than the 6.65. And then there was another scenario modeled here too, with just slightly different income thresholds. But that would be the model or the rationale.
Okay, thank you.
Which would look slightly different in your group, because your group already pays a higher percentage
Correct.
than Group F
Yeah.
and G.
Just a note, I'm really in favor of increasing assets. Especially if we can get behind the increasing revenue and funds above the ADEC. I'm really open to talking about employee contributions with that kind of firm upfront commitment to those other pieces. I become definitely a little more hesitant to discuss employee contributions, just as a note. So I think it's something that requires more discussion, reflecting our previous conversation.
So I understand that. I'm not sure how we go there, because we have to start making
Right.
decisions and
Have to run scenarios
Yep.
for the
Right.
actuary before we can come to the final point where we say what parts want to go into the mix
Yeah.
of the December recommendations.
Right. And if we put off talking about one until we conclude talking about the other, I'm not sure that that's, I think we have to talk about them all.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense to talk about them all, but I've just needed to state that my stance.
So what do people think about the tiered contribution rate?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my personal opinion is, whatever the contribution, I want to be able to go back and explain to somebody, this is the number and this is how we got to it. Right now, we're paying 8%, but I'm not sure anyone knows why that number was chosen, right? So, hey, we have to pay X amount and this is why, and this is what it's going to look like. I guess for me, that's where I'm looking at contribution rate in the sense of, I'm definitely open to it. I just want to be able to explain it and have it make sense to something. That's all.
So I definitely like the concept of the progressive contribution, rate, something that I mentioned before. And just one thing to tie it to is to think about whether it should be tied to something like risk sharing. So basically, based on the health of the fund, whether it goes back to, a consistent ratio at some point in the future. And basically, I think what we're asking for is those that are higher income earners to pay a little bit more into the system because things are not as good as we want them to be. And if they get to where we want them to be, then, you reverse back to sort of a similar contribution rate.
Or we stay there.
Or you stay there.
I think that's a judgment call,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I would love for us to express opinions about that judgment call because to me, the progressivity of that employee contribution rate really recognizes that people who are on the lower end of the salary scale need a greater percentage of their paycheck just to make ends meet, whereas people who make more, have more disposable income. And to me, the health of the fund doesn't change that. But I would defer to folks who are in the systems to talk about how they feel about progressivity of contribution rates.
Yeah, that I agree with you there. I think that we have a progressive income tax. We have actually a progressive property tax. At where my employment was previous to this, we paid our health premiums based on it was a tiered. So people who were making more money, those who were making $300,000 and $400,000 were paying a higher percentage because the percentage that they had left over to meet their needs was pretty high, and the percentage that the person making $17,000 had left over was not even enough to meet their needs. So
I was making my statement, assuming that the base rate wouldn't change for whatever the lowest threshold is that we set. So basically, unless we want to actually lower the contribution amount for lower income earners, but that you would keep that sort of baseline what people are paying now and increase for higher income earners. That's why I think you think about resetting it if the health of the fund gets to a certain point. But I think you also could keep it going because we might never get there, or there's other uses for it within the system.
okay, so we will look at that.
Molly Stoner, so Sarah, you were asking how people currently in the system feel about it. I agree with what Mike is saying because even though this is a trigger for people, I'm going to say, I do believe that piece about a pension is a promise. And you can talk to me about it at lunch if you don't. But I think that that people in the system are expecting a certain amount as a contractual agreement in their pension. And so if we are bargaining some of that away in the form of higher tiers paying more, and then the health of the fund increases, I think it serves us to go back to the original if the health of the fund gets to a point that we've agreed is strong and healthy, rather than continue to build funds on the backs employees who had been willing to give forth more money when the fund was unhealthy. So that we're not, so that we're giving and we're taking when we need to, but we're giving back when it's appropriate to do so. Thanks.
Yeah, mine is more philosophical. It's just, I think we should be progressive in everything we do. And those who have more should pay more. That's just a philosophical position of mine. So I think Eric had.
Yeah, so I'm open to all of these options, but to me, the progressivity of a tiered structure makes sense. But when I think about it, I almost think about it in two ways. One is like, what should the blended rate be? And then how do you implement that blended rate amongst the employees? Where do the tiers break down? You know, what's the total amount of income we want to bring in, and then where does it come in? Kind of implementation question.
So if I could just add some context to that, I don't think the amount of money that is required to fund the ADEC going forward based on the year-over-year increase could ever be fully funded through employee contributions alone. The hole is too big. But I think one interesting sort of point for context is think about what the size of the covered payroll is. And so that's roughly, it's close to 700 million on the state side. It's roughly 600 on the teacher side. So, 1% of that would translate to, $7 million on the state of additional revenue, 6 million on the teacher. So just to put some context around those numbers, and those numbers would increase with payroll growth every year too. But, we're looking at, we're not looking at moving the needle by hundreds of millions of dollars in the near term. Yeah.
Well, not on an annual basis, but if you look through the end of the amortization schedule,
Right.
I mean, it does that.
But even if we, it brings in, the present value of these is not colossal. So the present, if contributions were to increase by 1.1% for VSERS across the board, the present value of that additional contribution through 2039 is $73 million.
All right, so we'll have more conversation, Ellen. So the next one on here was kind of risk sharing. Yeah, I think well, it was, we didn't talk specifically about the fixed amount because we just jumped to the progressive, to the tiered contributions. But we could, the fixed amount could be tiered or not tiered, right? I mean, it's Mike's and Molly's, your suggestion that it'd be tied to the health of the fund. So that even if you had tiered, the way I understand this, even if you had tiered or just a flat rate, it could or would not have to be tied to the health of the fund. Either one. And you suggested, and Mike suggested, that maybe it should be tied to the health of the fund. And that's something that we can make a recommendation on if we want, but again, it's up to future legislators what they do with that, but yeah. Am I right about that? Okay.
I just have, is that the way that Beamers? Doesn't Beamers have something like that, the health of the fund?
So I would look to the treasurer to speak more on Beamers, but yeah, they adjust the contribution rates periodically based on,
They have an automatic inflator, right?
I believe so. At least on the
Corey knows,
employer
or it
side,
might be
but-
mine.
Yes, there was a law passed a few years ago that there was, I think it was 4 years out where they had incremental increases, but I believe it stopped. But I don't think it's beyond that. I have to go back and double check. But there was 1 year when they passed a law that had incremental increases, I think, for each of the next 4 or 5 successive years.
Do they have a cap? A cap? They have a cap on the increases? Like it could go to a certain.
No, it was just like a 0.25% or something like that each year for the next 4 years, for example. But I'll have to dig that out to see what that exactly was. But I believe it went beyond that.
Well, I mean, my thought, even at a quarter point, I mean, just looking ahead at some of the other documents, even adding like $15 million in new revenue in addition to $150 million in one-time money, you really start to bend that curve. Like, we're not gonna have the single bullet that's gonna knock all this down. So like, I understand the point that, well, 1% is roughly 13 million across the board. That's a lot. And then you add the 150 million one time, and I'm sure there's gonna be like 2 or 3 other things we change. And then we've made significant progress to that problem. So that's how I look at it. I don't think a small change, we should discount changes even if they're small, because even if we did something like this, where even if it took us 4 or 5 years to get up to a point or a point and a half on some of these, like that all benefits us in the long term. So I think more palatable to some people and explaining the changes of like, what, to unlock $150 million of one-time money, we had to come up with 13 million. That's a pretty good trade-off, right? Like we put in 13, got 150, among other things. So those are ways that, that is look at it too.
And just to echo, I like Corey's point too about not having it all done in 1 year, but that piece of, over time to build up to it over a couple of years, something to keep in mind.
I don't think we're gonna come up with enough this year to solve it.
Yeah, but thinking,
Have faith in that.
but thinking if
Yeah,
employee contributions were to rise,
right.
having that slow, gradually rise instead of it being an immediate rise, mapping that out over a few years.
So jumping then to the next, should we tie employee contributions to keep pace with the normal costs? And
See, some thumbs up. Some non-answers and a thumbs down.
some spacing outs.
I mean, I think if you do this kind of like progressive increase in rate, I think you're actually can take into effect some of these normal cost increases, right? Like this quarter
Yeah.
point, if we do it out enough time or whatever the number is, you kind of take the employees are paying more as the normal cost increases.
Right, so if you did the tiered or the progressive rates, then you wouldn't even have to consider.
Right, and then when you got
Yeah,
their income growth each year too, I think would cover
Yeah.
some of that.
yeah.
So
John?
I agree with Corey. I think it's your approach is better than just
Yeah.
saying a 50-50 split.
Yeah.
of the normal cost.
Okay.
Especially, I mean, how do you implement that? Given current percentage differences. I mean,
Yeah.
You cannot do that fairly. To the user. It would have to be over and over. So, just not gonna, income shock and employees. So I do think it's
Yeah.
your approach.
and I think it's just hard too. I mean, when we talk the blended thing, I mean, I just think, and I don't mean this anything, but I'll just use my example. Me working in the town in an administrative role, because I'm in the Beamers program, is very different than the guys who work in public works, or maybe our police officers. We don't have them, but might be in a Beamers. Like, I think as a public policy, we tend not to want law enforcement on the streets much past 55 years old. So like, that's gonna look different than someone like me who's in an office who, I may not want to work till 65, but I'm sitting at a desk and you know what I mean? Not making those changes. I think just in these policies, like there are certain jobs that, from a public policy perspective, they're no longer safe to do at a certain age, and we need to consider that as well.
Molly Stoner, I just want to really appreciate what you said, because I think I was thinking about that earlier when we were having a conversation of penalizing people who were not working to 65. And I think what you just said shed some light onto that, just to sort of keep that in our consciousness as we discuss all those possibilities.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah.
John, you mentioned the tiered approach just then. Were you thinking tiered combined with this gradual phased approach, or just speaking to the progressive tiered structure?
I'm more supportive of a progressive tiered structure rather than what some plans have done, which is, gone to a specific percentage split.
Yeah.
Contributions for the cover the main good example for the normal cost.
Yeah.
hopefully achieving the same result, but in a different, a very different way.
So the next bullet point on here, and I don't know where, I can't remember where this came from, but it's a slightly different question, different employee contributions for more generous benefits. And I don't know where that, I honestly don't know where that came from. And I don't, but it's implying, I guess, that you can buy a more generous retire pension plan if you put in more. And so Mike?
I think Senator Parent mentioned it at the end of the last meeting, and it was, so if there are benefit changes that are being proposed, if people want to keep the benefits the same, can they buy up on the contribution amount to keep their benefit the same? I think that was the concept.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's kind of where I was going. So like if you're, like I've had some people, a school teacher reached out to me last spring when changes were talked about, and he goes, I'm 7 years away from retirement. And at the time, the conversation was gonna add a significant amount of years. He goes, can I just pay more? Like, what can I pay to
Oh.
not have another 7 years of work or whatever? I forgot the
I
exact
see.
number. So like, the concept was if there's gonna be that change and we're gonna do a hard cutoff, like, can they chip in X amount, you know, to still only work 7 years versus another 15 or something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah, okay.
And I think this was kind of a similar lump together a little bit with that of the idea of electing earlier on to pay more into the system in your career for years of service time. That way the money is getting into the system faster, so it has time to compound with interest. You know, while not changing the amount of years that you have to work, you're actually buying it. And I'd imagine there must be a number that would benefit both parties.
Well, the question this is just clicking in my mind and trying to explain it to state employees and new employees and teachers, like, how well are you guys educated in like retirement? Like, I'm just trying to think of like at 22, I went into finance at 22. So I was really in tune to what $1 I put away at 22 years old meant long-term. And there's like math equations you can show people. I mean, from a pure retirement, not scare people, you literally can save X percent of your income from like age 22 to 30, not save another $1. And then, but the people who start saving for retiring at 30 and work to, you know, they have to put away till they retire, and you retire with about the same amount of money. It shows how important those first 8 to 10 years are. And, you know, part of our recommendation, how well are we educating public employees about the importance of, like, if we're gonna have something like Andrew, like if you come out of college, you can put 10% away versus 6%, and then this is what this means for your retirement, because this is what long-term, like you may not be able to afford to, but you may say, you know what, I'm gonna make some lifestyle changes that allow me to put that away so I can have this flexibility later in my career. I just don't know how well we educate. I don't know if that's part of this, and I'm sorry to go into a tangent, but to me, it's very important when we talk about like why 8% or why 7%, what goes away, because these are real dollars. And then that long-term 1% may not seem like a lot, but over 40 years, it's a lot of money.
And yeah, I would agree. I think that education piece in general is probably lacking. You know, financial literacy is a tough subject and uncomfortable for a lot of people. So anything that can be done to educate people, I think would be really helpful. And like you mentioned, there are some people that even with that knowledge might not be able to do it. But anything we can do, I don't know if that would become a human resources part as part of the hiring.
That would, yeah, that would be great. Cause I was just, as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, cause I started after school, you know, I went in and became a PO and I was like, what? And I really had to have people in my life go, hey, you're supposed to have deferred comp. You're supposed to do this. I'm like, oh, really? You don't know that type of thing, because when you start these state employment jobs, you're just like, oh yeah, I'm doing this, but you don't think, and you don't have that financial literacy unless that's part of something in your family that you are, you know, they're telling you that immediately, or you majored in it in college or school or whatever, it's some type of interest. But it's not something when you're in your early 20s thinking about, hey, I need to make sure I have these two things for my retirement and blah, blah. I did not think about it until I was like 28. And then I was like, oh, I'm supposed to be doing what? I'm supposed to be planning for what? And they're like, do you really want to work till you're 80, Leona? Think about it. Oh, okay, let me get started. So that's a great piece. It's true.
Kate,
Don't have it.
I just want to, I'm always considering the folks who, when given a choice, don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
And that's what I worry about most, is if we start talking about different employee contribution rates for more generous benefits, that we're offering, we feel as though maybe we're offering a choice. And for many people, there's no choice. They have to pay the least that they can pay in order to keep their families and lives moving in a direction that's worth living.
Yeah, if you're on the lower end of the pay scale.
Even if you're on the upper end,
Well,
even if you
yeah.
are a middle income kind of person, if you're a single parent and you've got 3 kids, you're making an income that looks okay on paper. But you've got a lot of expenses, medical problems, older parents you're taking care of, whatever it is. I want to just make sure that we're always mindful of the people for whom, when given a choice, they don't have choices.
That's a good point. And I just wanted to bring, bring in the 457 and 403 plans into this. I mean, that's kind of the more of the discretionary supplement to the base pension plan. Certainly education around those plans, I completely support that. That would be, yeah, I mean, the knowledge, I think, in the workforce varies. Some people are very in tune to that, and some people are. So the more that we can educate people, I think the best.
So where are we on that? Because I really think Kate has a really good point there, that a choice isn't a choice unless you can make it.
Well, if I may, one way that might be helpful to think about this is, my home state recently did this a couple of years ago, and they offered 2 different plans for new hires. And the total contribution rate is very similar between the 2 plans. I think there's a difference of 1% or less. But the difference is how much of the money goes to a DB versus a DC. It's a side-by-side hybrid. So if you are a employee who joins the workforce at 22 and doesn't plan to stay until retirement, it may be advantageous to put more money in the deferred comp plan for them, because that makes more sense to their particular trajectory. And then they get less of a DB benefit in retirement as a result. On the flip side, there's another choice where if you are on a different career trajectory and you're thinking maybe you will be there for 30 plus years and actually stay there till retirement, you can elect to have more of your contribution go into a DB plan with a higher benefit multiplier and less of it going to a DC plan. So I'm not saying that's better or worse, but it's one thing to maybe think about in this context of choices where it's not necessarily about how much or how little you're paying out of your check, but where does that money go and what type of retirement benefit do you get from it? Because typically in the DB system, you are most advantaged if you stay in the system for your career and you leave upon retirement. You tend not to be very advantaged if you start your career early and terminate after 5 years, when you're 30, because your benefit's not going to grow with all of your salary growth by the time you can get it.
No, I think Chris raises a good point, especially, I think we've seen workforces changing. People are not staying in single jobs for 30 years as much as they did in the past. And so as we move forward with our recommendations, I do think we should think about, people coming into the workforce today, are they anticipating staying with the state or with their school district for 30 years or not? And if they're not, do we want to offer an option that is more portable than a pension plan? So I think it's something we need to consider. I mean, looking as a recruitment and retention thing, I mean, if people aren't going to stay 30 years, does it make sense only to give them one option? So I just raise that as We look at how people are choosing to work today.
I guess as, if as a committee, we're going to say, hey, we recommend this should be looked at, I'm not sure we as a committee could sit here and say, okay, we agree with this and these are some of the plans that we think should be offered. I don't know that we have the time to create plans and benefits and make these structural changes that we're talking about. So that's, I guess that's the way I look at it. Like that seems to me like if someone decides to do that, whether it's us saying, hey, we think it should be looked at, I think that's a much more in-depth look at things and how will it look like, and these are the options that we have and things like that. Just to me as a committee, I think it's going to be, if we decide to do that, it's just going to be a lot of time spent that we're here to do and take away from other things. So,
And that may not have much of an impact on the problem that we're trying to solve.
solve.
for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Kate?
Sort of responding to what John was saying, I want to be in a building where folks want to stay for 30 years. It's really hard right now, really, really hard to find teachers. And then once you find them, if they're not going to stick around, there's a lot that goes into learning. Like we're always learning, and the school districts and by way of the taxpayers are investing a lot of money in helping those teachers develop professionally. And so I don't think we want to offer a plan that says, hey, you could take this one if you're only in it for the next 6 years.
Well, and to take what Kate said and sort of blend it with what Leona said before, you know, a choice is only a choice between two different pension plan options if somebody's been educated on what the different options are and what they mean for you. And, you know, I think a lot of people, when they learn that they have a new job, whether it's a state workforce job or a teaching job, are focused on prepping for day one of their job and not really very focused on making the calculation about what their future pension benefits might look like and whether they plan to stay, you know, at this school or in state employment for the next 30 years. The other thing that I want to say, and I really appreciate Dan, you know, bringing up the point that these are important conversations, but maybe not central to what we're doing. But the other observation that I make about this question of offering new options for future hires is I have a lot of teachers in my neck of the woods who came into teaching after having done another career, and they went through a non-traditional teacher training program. And so they may not have begun teaching until they were 28, 30, 35. And so their career trajectory has been very different, and they may or may not have another retirement benefit that they started with. But there's a lot of value in these people who come into teaching after having done something else. And so I think it's worth recognizing that what looks appealing to them if they're coming from a private sector job, you know, that had a DC plan, what looks appealing to them might be different than what looks appealing to somebody who came out of a four-year college and went right into teaching. So just flagging that for.
So maybe what we should, I don't know if we have agreed on this or not, but I think Dan's suggestion that this is something that we might want to put in the report, but we might not want to get into the details of how we would offer it and what it would look like and what the plans would look like, but that it is something that we consider worth more study, that whether there's because it isn't going to contribute to very much to what our issue is right now, what we have to address. So can we agree that we would put that in the report, that there is some appeal to this, but we need to look at it more and how it would affect different people and how it would affect recruitment, retainment, all of that.
And it might look different between teachers and state employees.
Yeah.
And different groups along
Yeah.
employees.
And we don't have data about it now.
Right.
And we haven't done that sociological data.
Right, so let's,
And Senator White is correct, and I'll just reiterate that, yeah, if you make a change, just moving forward for new hires, that is not really going to solve your immediate math problem that we're dealing with now, unless it's coupled with some sort of incentive to maybe encourage people to switch of the plan they're currently in and move to the new one. But this, I'd sort of lump into the first around amortization, where it's kind of a risk mitigation strategy moving forward.
all right, so can we agree that we could put something like that in the report? That it's worth looking at more. But we can't do it. All right, we have mixed review on that one. So let's move to the next two are kind of connected. Redirect some portion of the school surplus funds to pensions or OPEB and the future budget surplus, and that you addressed the general fund budget surpluses, but we haven't addressed the issue of school budget surpluses.
So my concern regarding the school surplus funds, and I'm only going to speak to Rutland and as a member, 13-year member of the school board there, what we did, we never had any building funds or reserve for a new roof or whatever it may have been. And then any funds, we always did a contingency that was about $250,000, and on a $50 million budget, I'll let you do the math, that's pretty small contingency. However, any funds remaining in the contingency current year rolled into the budget next year as revenue. So we never kept any surplus. So my concern would be that if we were to tell them, okay, you have $100,000 left over at the end of the year, that money is going to be directed into something other than next year's budget as revenue, that's a concern for me.
I brought this idea because I understand some school districts use the money for a capital fund, and they've let their capital funds get pretty healthy, and it's not going back to next year's budget to pay off. It's not, and I don't, every school district's obviously different. I don't know how 68 or whatever practice, but I wouldn't say grab all, but I think if we're asking the state to contribute our surpluses, and by our surpluses, I mean, when we talk about our $7 billion budget, it includes the ed fund. When we're looking at our surpluses, like, are we taking some of those surpluses too? If not, we're just, you know what I mean? It's continuing. I think there's just I mean, the ed fund's roughly $2 billion. Like, there's just money there. I mean, even if there's a surplus of 2%, and we put 1% of that into one-time money expenditures, that's $20 million. And when we had that discussion of just 1% in this fund and 1% here, it's apply that to anything. I just, paying for teachers' retirement is a very important part of having good teachers and a good education system. So I don't see it as a disconnect and not investing those dollars back in education. They're just invested with our teachers versus something else. So that's why I think it makes sense to at least, again, similar to other things, I don't know how we would operationally do it. Hold school districts accountable. I think it would take a partnership with teachers so that school districts aren't putting in things they might not need, so they don't have that surplus. It's like, oh, we got to spend it and go away. But I think it's worth the conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely worth exploring. Thinking about Peter's point that we want schools to have some contingencies for a roof. We do have some aging buildings. So if it's not 100%, there's maybe 50%. Also thinking along your thoughts, Corey, we don't want schools spending money just to be like, oh, we don't want a surplus. Administrators, superintendents are also part of the pension plan, so I don't see them just willy-nilly spending money.
So, yeah.
I have a question. It's basically not really understanding how the ed fund works, but money goes out from the ed fund to districts, right? And then they can manage money accordingly and have a contingency fund or a capital project fund. But then the larger fund just also can build a balance. And maybe that's the more appropriate lever to kind of to look at. So, I mean, how does that balance get built? Where does the delta come from? What goes up to districts to what comes in?
So the education fund is a demand type fund. The amount that is needed to be taxed for property for the education fund is based upon the budgets that have passed. If you pass a budget that's $20 million in your district, send that budget to the state is going to fund the $20 million. There's the tap on the ed fund, and let's say it's $20 million and you raise locally $1 million on something. So your tap on the ed fund is 19 million. The state's going to send you $19 million, and then they're going to put that in the calculation as to where to set the property tax rates to raise that $19 million along with all the other districts' needs. So it does not build a reserve per se. There is a structural reserve that is in the fund. We always have a budget stabilization reserve that is, the best way to describe that is in my checkbook, there's actually $1,000 below zero, just in case. And that's a structural reserve. So if you look at the structural reserve in the ed fund, it's very similar. It's to make sure that we never run out of cash or that we never bounce a check. Other than that, there is no reserve.
Okay.
There's one right now because of the ARPA funding, but
we
historically, no.
can build surpluses though, because sales and use goes into the ed fund, as well as, lottery might outperform. There's other funding streams that could outperform projections. The other piece too is a lot of times when we set the tax rate in a legislature, there might be other building towns. A lot of times don't set their grand list until finalize it until right before bills go out in July. So there's always a small 1 or 2% discrepancy. Maybe the town built 3 new homes that we didn't know about when we did it. So $8,500 in that town comes into that wasn't, it's hard to get that perfect number. So there's small things that change that, but, and a lot of times those get offset because when people do like a property, when you go into, like, most people don't get, so like when someone goes and says my house is overvalued in a tax assessment, the town say the town lowers the tax for that year, the town will eat not only the lower tax on their budget, they're going to eat the whole lower school portion too. And so it's really complicated. We built a really complicated system, but
But ultimately, the intent is to not run a surplus in the ed fund. It is truly a fund that's meant to be demand driven.
And a lot of times when there is a surplus, we use that to buy down the next year's
correct
property tax rate. So we give it back to the taxpayer,
Yeah.
but we buy down that property tax. If there's like $80 million, we'll buy down like 8 cents or 7 cents.
Okay.
Tax rate.
That happened this past year.
And we also had sales and use and purchase and use tax on cars really overperformed projections this year. And that's to what Senator Parent was mentioning about the ARPA funds, that direct consumer spending going out there. That's why we're kind of an anomaly right now, is because we brought a little more money in from those specific sources than we expected.
Okay, so we can suggest that if there were surplus funds, that a percentage might go, but trying not to have surplus funds, but with the state budget surplus funds, recommend a certain percentage go to the unfunded liability.
I mean, ultimately, that's kind of going back to the taxpayer too. So
Yeah.
it's just in a different form.
And the next one, I do not even remember what it was, property asset sales,
Oh,
deposit.
that was, somebody mentioned selling surplus property state owns,
Oh.
using that money to put into the system.
I see. Oh, okay. All right. And I don't know if,
So while sure, that's not, that makes sense, that would be fine. State surplus property always operates at loss,
yes,
always,
we buy high and sell low.
or give it away. Buy high and give it away. So
Oh, yeah, right.
my comment here is that it would be net of all costs.
Well, I have personally, this is one of those things that I disagree with, where we find the funds, that we can look at what funds we need, but where they come from is, I'm not gonna say, because maybe we need those for other purposes.
And you caused me to think of something. If there's a bond, if there's any bonded debt that remains there, we're now getting into a very difficult and legally required area. So I think that we would be best to leave that alone, simply because if we do something with proceeds from something that still had bonded debt attached to it, we could actually lose the ability to issue a debt that's used for bonding purposes.
Okay, then. Yeah, Andrew.
I think also part of this was connected to the land lease for ski areas that was mentioned by Doug Hopper. Yeah, so I think they're similar ideas, kind of separate, but I think that was also part of maybe what that was referencing.
Yeah, I honestly don't remember. I'm gonna cross it off.
And from what he had said, it sounded to me like there were some legal reasons we were tied into the really low lease rates. and
Oh,
stuff.
Yeah,
Because the ski
because
areas had
requires their
written in a
consent.
certain
Well, because
way.
of the way we wrote the contract.
Right.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
wonder if there's any wiggle room there.
Well, there might be, I don't think that's for us. I think that I mean, without getting into, spending a lot of time getting into the leases and how, and I was on the institutions committee once when we looked at this again, and it is very complicated and very legally a mess. So, I mean, I think it would be beyond our ability to get into that in detail and suggest that to people that we should relook at the leases. That's just my,
Recommendation.
okay. So we have just a couple minutes before noon, and John has a hard stop at 12. I do know that. So there are two more on before we get to reduce liabilities, and then I think we're going to look at that again this afternoon, right? We're going to continue talking about it. So this is a good breaking point here. Solicit ideas from employees on how to save money and reduce any resulting strategy savings to the pension funds.
So since I can't quite conceptualize the jar on the table that we put those things into in order to understand how that money would go into the pension system. So it's a great concept, and I don't at all disagree with the fact that it is the employees who are on the ground doing these jobs that oftentimes can see where there's waste in the system. I just don't know how in various departments and in various school districts, how Molly as a teacher would go up her chain to say, this is wasteful, let's set aside this money and it goes into the pension bucket. And the principal or the school board could say, thank you very much for that savings. And we would really love to be able to use that to augment our outdoor classroom. Thank you very much. Goodbye. I think it's a really great concept, and I completely agree that we ought to be looking for and listening to employee voices in terms of how our systems can be more efficient. I can't conceive of how you put that figurative bucket in the center of the table into which people can deposit their savings.
So we, a few years ago, passed, I'm sure it passed legislation that encouraged employees to come up with ideas around waste and better systems and stuff. And there was actually a reward attached to it for the individual employee. And that, as far as I know, is still in existence. Whether it's ever been used or not, I have No, it is,
It is.
it is in existence, right? And
Nice.
so if we have, but I think Sarah's right, how do you determine exactly what the savings are from those? In that case, it was a kind of a reward to the employee for being creative and forward-looking and stuff, but Peter.
So those, I'm sorry, those are mine, and I took those from when Doug was here and just, you know, what he was saying to me, like, there are ways to save some money in government.
Mhm.
And however those ways are, if we can find some of those ways, and then, again, like you said, structurally, how do you redirect it? I don't know, but I'm just saying that, you know, I think there are ways, as Corey was saying, you know, it might just be a little bit here, but a little bit here today adds up later. And so maybe those are more just like recommendations from this committee, like there are ways to save some money.
Mhm.
You know, maybe we should be looking at some of those and trying to see if we can redirect some of those funds to something. So kind of where I was coming from and thinking, not that we have to go and say this is how it will be done or anything like that. So I'm not suggesting to sell Mount Mansfield tomorrow or anything like that. So
Maybe we can get a good price from New Hampshire.
yeah.
Currently, what would occur if there were savings within a department in state government, right? Those funds at the end of the year would remain unspent. They would have been allocated to the appropriated and allocated to that department, but would be unspent. So one of two things would occur. The Department of Finance and Management would recommend that those funds roll over for next year because there is a purpose for which they should and could be used. That meet the legislature's concept, or the funds would revert to the general fund, become unallocated at the end of the year, and then fall into our end of year construct 50/50. So that's really where it is now. So yes, any money that is currently saved by employees actually would go into that construct, and right now end up half of it would end up in OPEB.
So maybe it's a marketing campaign if we do end up with that contract of like surplus dollars do end up going to help the pension program. Just, you know, it's just a twice before you print. Think, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
those small things, like remind people that surplus is. So conceptually, like you said, it is kind of happening, but like maybe just, and I think some of this is just an education thing too. Like think twice before you spend. Think, you know, do you need it or is it?
Yeah.
Excellent. That seems like we're sort of at well, we're at a stopping point anyway, because we're at noon. We could talk about charge more for service credit purchases, but let's flag that for the afternoon conversation. We do have a chunk of time this afternoon to start in on the liabilities side of this sheet. And so
I just want to make one point on the, I think we talked about surplus and here specifically about maybe instead of holiday and premiums that can be dedicated to. I don't think there's a specific reference there.
that's
Yeah.
right. And it didn't make it to the
Yes.
list. So let's make sure that we add
My apologies.
that.
I guess neither Chris nor I.
Oh, Jeanette.
Yeah, so like this month of August, there's a premium holiday for state employees. The fund had, our state fund has excess. So instead of that going to a premium holiday, maybe that's set aside to the fund.
Yes, thank you for catching that.
Thanks.
Excellent. So see you all at 1 o'clock.
And where are you meeting today?